Tonight, we journey back to November 1620 to uncover the real story behind Thanksgiving that your history books never told you. You'll discover the forgotten voices, the complex encounters, and the dark truths hidden beneath our familiar holiday traditions. What really happened when two worlds collided on the shores of a new continent, and why the indigenous people's perspective changes everything you thought you knew about gratitude and survival. So get comfortable, pull up those blankets, and let your mind drift as we explore these whispered secrets of history together. If you enjoy these peaceful historical journeys, consider subscribing to join our community of curious sleepers. Now, close your eyes and let the gentle waves of time carry you back 4 centuries to where autumn leaves danced in unfamiliar winds and two civilizations stood on the threshold of change. Chapter 1: Beginnings. A New Land. Long before any European eyes glimpsed these shores, this continent pulsed with life and language. Dozens of indigenous nations had called these lands home for thousands of years, their voices weaving through ancient forests like sacred songs. The Wampanoag, the Massachusetts, the Nauset, each tribe carrying stories older than memory, their harvest ceremonies honoring the earth's generous gifts, their wisdom rooted in harmony with nature's endless cycles. Across the vast Atlantic, another story was unfolding. Desperate English families huddled in cramped quarters, their wooden ship groaning against endless waves. The Mayflower carried more than passengers. It bore dreams of religious freedom, hopes for prosperity, and the weight of profound uncertainty. These pilgrims had abandoned everything familiar, trading comfort for faith, security for the promise of a new beginning in an unknown wilderness, their prayers whispered into salt-tinged air. September turned to October, October surrendered to November, and still the Mayflower pushed through churning seas. Children cried in the darkness below deck, while adults struggled to maintain hope amid sickness and despair. Food supplies dwindled, water grew stale, and death visited their floating community more than once. Yet they pressed forward, driven by an unshakable belief that divine providence would guide them safely to their promised land, their destiny awaiting on distant shores. Meanwhile, on those distant shores, indigenous watchers observed strange sails on the horizon. These were not the first European visitors to their lands. Spanish explorers had come before, bringing diseases that decimated entire villages. The great chief Massasoit of the Wampanoag Confederation remembered his people had learned to view such arrivals with careful eyes, understanding that newcomers could bring both opportunity and catastrophe, their arrival marking a crossroads in history. November winds carried the scent of approaching winter, and finally, after 66 days at sea, the Mayflower's passengers glimpsed land. But this was not their intended destination of Virginia. Storms had driven them far north to Cape Cod. Exhausted families peered through salt-stained windows at a coastline of rolling dunes and dark forests, a landscape both beautiful and forbidding, their relief tempered by the knowledge that their true journey was only beginning. The November air bit sharp and cold as the first scouting parties rowed toward shore, their boots touching sand that had known only indigenous footsteps for millennia. Ancient paths wound through forests, where maple and oak shed golden leaves, where streams ran clear and wild, where every rock and tree held meaning in languages these newcomers could not understand, a living landscape soon to bear witness to encounters that would reshape everything. From hidden vantage points, indigenous eyes watched these pale strangers stumble through unfamiliar terrain. The newcomers moved awkwardly through the wilderness, their clothing unsuited for forest travel, their voices carrying strange sounds that startled birds from their perches. Some watchers felt curiosity, others concern. All understood they were witnessing something unprecedented, the beginning of a story whose ending remained unwritten, suspended between possibility and peril. Winter's approach demanded immediate action. The pilgrims chose a site they called Plymouth. Unaware they were settling on land, the Patuxet people had recently called home. Disease brought by earlier European contacts had emptied these villages, leaving cleared fields and freshwater streams, a tragic gift that would enable the colonists' survival. The irony was lost on the newcomers, who saw only providence in this convenient abandonment, not the human cost that preceded their arrival. Through frozen months, death stalked both communities. The Pilgrims built their settlement while burying their dead, nearly half their number succumbing to cold, hunger, and disease. In nearby Wampanoag villages, elders debated how to respond to these struggling strangers. Some advocated for distance, remembering the devastation previous European contact had brought, while others sensed opportunity, recognizing that alliance might serve their people's interests in uncertain times. Wisdom weighing against wariness. Spring's arrival brought more than warmth. It carried the footsteps of a remarkable figure. Samoset walked boldly into Plymouth, greeting the astonished colonists in broken English, learned from earlier encounters with fishermen and traders. His appearance shattered assumptions, challenged expectations, and opened the door to possibilities neither side had imagined. Here was the first bridge between two worlds, a translator of more than words, a herald of conversations that would echo through centuries of shared and contested history. Soon after, Samoset returned with Tisquantum, known to history as Squanto, whose personal story embodied the complex tragedy of first contact. Kidnapped years earlier by European slavers, sold into bondage, and miraculously returned to find his entire village dead from disease, Tisquantum chose to help these struggling newcomers. His knowledge of both worlds, born from profound loss, would become their lifeline, his wisdom bridging the gap between survival and catastrophe, hope and despair. Under Tisquantum's guidance, the colonists learned to plant corn with fish for fertilizer, to tap maple trees for sweet sap, to navigate forest paths that connected distant communities. His teachings transformed their relationship with the land, turning hostile wilderness into productive home. Yet every lesson carried weight of unspoken history, every kindness shadowed by the losses that made such knowledge available, generosity born from tragedy, hope emerging from the ashes of destruction. As summer ripened into autumn, the colonists' first harvest exceeded all expectations. Corn stood tall in fields where struggle had once reigned. Pumpkins swelled golden in the sun, and wildfowl filled the marshes. Governor William Bradford declared a time of thanksgiving, inviting their indigenous neighbors to join the celebration. For 3 days, two peoples shared food and games, their laughter echoing across the settlement, a brief moment of harmony suspended between past sorrows and future conflicts. Yet even in celebration, deeper currents flowed beneath the surface. Chief Massasoit attended with 90 warriors, his presence both diplomatic gesture and subtle reminder of his people's strength. The feast represented many things: gratitude for survival, hope for cooperation, and the complex negotiations of power between communities with vastly different worldviews. This fragile peace would face countless tests, but for now, in the golden light of autumn, possibility bloomed, tender and precious, awaiting tomorrow's choices. Chapter 2: the first encounter. Picture this moment, a crisp morning in March 1621, when two worlds collided on the shores of what we now call Massachusetts. The air thick with anticipation and fear. English settlers, weakened by a brutal winter, suddenly face visitors they never expected. But this wasn't the friendly meeting your history books described. No, this was something far more complex, far more human, and infinitely more fascinating than you've ever been told. Samoset emerged from the forest edge, a Wampanoag leader who'd been watching these strangers for months. His presence sent shockwaves through Plymouth Colony because he spoke English. How could this be possible? These bewildered settlers wondered. Unknown to them, Samoset had learned from fishermen along the coast, traders who'd been visiting these waters long before the Mayflower ever set sail. His first words, "Hello, Englishmen," forever changed two civilizations. The settlers stared in stunned silence, their muskets trembling in uncertain hands. This wasn't how they'd imagined first contact. In their minds, they'd expected either violent savages or empty wilderness. Instead, they faced a confident leader who understood their language better than they understood his intentions. Samoset walked boldly into their settlement, observing their weakened condition, their desperate circumstances, with eyes that held centuries of wisdom about surviving in this land. What the English didn't realize was that they'd built Plymouth on the ruins of Patuxet, a Wampanoag village recently devastated by disease. The very ground beneath their feet held memories, stories, and the bones of an entire community. Samoset knew this history intimately. He walked among their crude shelters, knowing that just years before, sophisticated longhouses had stood in these exact spots, filled with families who'd called this place home for generations. The tension was electric, palpable in every exchanged glance. English children peered from doorways, wide-eyed at this unexpected visitor who spoke their tongue. Samoset requested beer, a simple human gesture that somehow bridged the gap between two vastly different worldviews. The colonists, desperate for allies, yet terrified of deception, found themselves in an impossible position. Trust this stranger or remain isolated in a land that had already claimed half their number. Behind Samoset's calm demeanor lay strategic calculation. The Wampanoag had been observing these English newcomers throughout the harsh winter, watching them struggle, die, and barely survive in conditions that indigenous peoples navigated with seasonal wisdom. This wasn't charity Samoset offered, but diplomacy born of necessity. His people faced threats from rival tribes, and these struggling Europeans might prove useful allies if properly managed and understood. The language barrier created layers of misunderstanding that rippled through every conversation. When Samoset spoke of land, he meant something entirely different than English concepts of ownership. Land was relationship, responsibility, stewardship passed down through generations. But the English heard opportunity, possession, something to be claimed and controlled. These fundamental differences in worldview would echo through centuries, shaping conflicts that continue resonating today in ways we're only beginning to understand. Days passed before Samoset returned, this time bringing Squanto, whose story defies everything you think you know about this period. Born in Patuxet, the very village where Plymouth now stood, Squanto had been kidnapped years earlier, sold into slavery in Spain, escaped to England, learned the language, and incredibly found his way home, only to discover his entire community had perished from disease. Imagine that homecoming, that devastating realization. Squanto's presence complicated everything. Here was a man who'd lived in European cities, who understood both worlds intimately, who'd experienced the absolute worst of colonial contact. Yet he chose to help these struggling English families. Why? Historians still debate. Was it survival strategy, genuine compassion, or something more complex? Perhaps he saw in their desperation an echo of his own losses, his own struggle to find belonging in a world forever changed. The conversations between these groups reveal layers of calculation on all sides. Massasoit, the great Wampanoag leader, eventually arrived with 60 warriors, a show of strength that left no doubt about the balance of power. The English, weakened and vulnerable, suddenly understood their precarious position. These weren't primitive peoples grateful for European presence, but sophisticated political entities making strategic decisions about unprecedented circumstances. Every gesture carried weight, every word, multiple meanings. When Massasoit removed his weapons before entering Plymouth, it wasn't submission, but diplomatic protocol. When Governor Carver responded in kind, it wasn't bravery, but recognition of his desperate circumstances. These rituals of respect, these careful negotiations, reveal the intelligence and sophistication on both sides that simplified historical narratives often ignore, painting a far more complex picture of human encounter. The treaty they negotiated wasn't the simple friendship pact your textbooks described. It was a sophisticated mutual defense agreement, recognizing each group's sovereignty while establishing protocols for interaction. The Wampanoag would not attack Plymouth, Plymouth would not attack the Wampanoag, and both would aid each other against outside threats. This wasn't European charity toward indigenous peoples, but recognition of indigenous strength and the colonists' dependency on indigenous knowledge. But beneath the formal agreements, deeper currents flowed. The indigenous perspective, rarely recorded in English documents, tells of profound unease, of spiritual disruption caused by European presence. The land itself seemed wounded, animals behaving strangely, natural rhythms disrupted by foreign practices. Wampanoag oral traditions speak of prophetic dreams, warnings about changes that would ripple through generations, premonitions that proved tragically accurate as European settlement expanded. Women on both sides watched these negotiations with particular interest. Wampanoag women, who held significant political power in their matrilineal society, observed English women's subordinate status with curiosity and concern. English women, isolated from extended family networks, watched indigenous women's confidence and authority with wonder. These gender dynamics, rarely discussed in traditional histories, shaped daily interactions and long-term cultural exchange in ways we're only now beginning to appreciate. The children from both communities became bridges between worlds, learning each other's languages and customs with the flexibility of youth. Indigenous children taught English children which plants healed, which berries nourished, which paths led safely through the forest. English children shared stories of distant lands, of technologies and ideas that fascinated their indigenous peers. These connections, formed in play and curiosity, created bonds that would influence both communities for generations. As spring melted into summer, the initial encounter had established patterns that would define relationships for decades. Trust mixed with wariness, cooperation shadowed by cultural misunderstanding, hope tempered by growing awareness of irreconcilable differences. That first meeting, marked by tentative words and careful gestures, had set in motion changes that neither side could fully comprehend, ripples in time that continue shaping our world today in ways both beautiful and tragic. Chapter 3: Harvests and Alliances. As autumn painted the Massachusetts landscape in brilliant golds and crimson reds, something extraordinary was taking shape between two worlds. The settlers, desperate and learning, worked alongside the Wampanoag people, who had called this land home for countless generations. What emerged wasn't just survival, it was the delicate beginning of understanding, a partnership born from necessity that would reshape everything they thought they knew about cooperation and trust in this new world. The morning mist clung to the fields as English hands learned to tend corn in ways their ancestors never imagined. Squanto moved between the rows, his patient voice explaining the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash, growing together in ancient harmony, each plant supporting the others, just as these unlikely neighbors were beginning to support each other. The settlers watched in wonder as indigenous wisdom transformed their struggling plots into promising gardens filled with hope. Massasoit, the great sachem of the Wampanoag, understood what many historians would later overlook. This wasn't simple charity or naive friendship, it was strategic alliance, a calculated decision to work with these newcomers rather than against them. His people had already witnessed what European diseases could do to their communities. Perhaps cooperation offered a path forward that pure resistance could not. The politics of survival ran deeper than any feast could reveal. Through the warm summer months, children from both communities played together near the growing gardens. English words mixed with Algonquian phrases, as small hands learned to identify which berries were sweet, which roots could heal, which leaves could season their evening meals. These children, untouched by the fears and prejudices of their elders, created bonds that transcended the careful diplomatic arrangements their parents had crafted. Innocence bridged what politics could not always reach. The harvest moon rose full and golden over Plymouth as September surrendered to October. Corn stalks stood tall and proud, their ears heavy with kernels that promised sustenance through the coming winter. Pumpkins dotted the fields like orange lanterns, while beans hung thick on their climbing vines. For the first time since their arrival, the English colonists dared to believe they might actually survive another year. Hope tasted sweeter than any crop they had ever grown. Governor William Bradford walked through the abundant fields, calculating stores for winter, but his thoughts wandered beyond mere survival. These Wampanoag neighbors had shared more than agricultural knowledge. They had offered something the colonists desperately needed, but rarely acknowledged: legitimacy, recognition, a sense that they belonged in this place, that their presence here was not just theft or invasion, but perhaps something that could be mutually beneficial for both peoples. The women worked side by side, English and Wampanoag hands preparing the feast that would live in memory for centuries. Venison roasted over open fires, while cornbread baked in Dutch ovens. Wild fowl turned golden on wooden spits as the aroma of sage and thyme drifted through the settlement. Each dish represented not just sustenance, but the blending of two culinary traditions, creating something entirely new from the marriage of European techniques and indigenous ingredients. As the feast day dawned, nearly 100 people gathered in Plymouth. Wampanoag families arrived with their own contributions: wild game, fresh fish, succulent shellfish from the nearby waters. The English had prepared their harvest vegetables and what grains they could manage, but beneath the abundance lay unspoken tensions, different expectations, different understandings of what this gathering meant, different hopes for what their shared future might hold. History balanced on the edge of every conversation. Elder Brewster offered prayers in English, while Wampanoag spiritual leaders honored the Creator in their own sacred language. Two traditions acknowledging the same divine source of their blessings, though through vastly different cultural lenses. The settlers saw God's providence in their survival. The Wampanoag saw the natural cycle of seasons and the gifts of Mother Earth. Neither fully understood the other's spiritual framework, yet both recognized the profound gratitude that filled this autumn afternoon. Children ran between the tables, their laughter echoing off the wooden structures that now dotted the landscape. English and Wampanoag young ones played games that needed no translation, racing, hiding, sharing sweet treats that mothers had prepared with loving hands. In their innocent joy, the future seemed bright and uncomplicated. These children could not imagine the darker chapters that history would write about their families, their communities, their descendants. For now, there was only abundance and friendship. As twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, stories were shared around the fires. Wampanoag elders spoke of ancient harvests, of times when their people's corn had sustained entire villages through harsh winters. English settlers told tales of their homeland, of different harvests under different skies. Through these stories, each group began to understand not just what the other had gained, but what they had lost in coming to this moment of shared celebration. The treaty between Plymouth and the Wampanoag was more than diplomatic paperwork. It was a living agreement that required daily choices. When English livestock wandered into indigenous gardens, how would they respond? When Wampanoag hunting parties crossed colonial boundaries, what precedent would be set? Every interaction tested their commitment to peaceful coexistence. The feast was beautiful, but the real work of alliance happened in 1,000 small moments that history rarely recorded. Massasoit understood what many English settlers did not yet grasp. Their success was temporary, fragile, dependent on factors beyond their control. More ships would come from Europe. More colonists would demand land. The delicate balance they had achieved here in Plymouth was just the beginning of a much larger and more complex story. Tonight they celebrated together, but tomorrow would bring new challenges that would test every promise made under these autumn stars. As the last embers of the feast fires glowed in the darkness, families began to drift back to their homes. English colonists retreated to their wooden houses, while Wampanoag families returned to their villages. The warmth of the day lingered in their hearts, but the cool October air whispered of harder seasons ahead. Winter was coming, as it always did, bringing new tests of their carefully crafted alliance. The harvest was over, but the real work of survival was just beginning. In the quiet hours after the celebration, Plymouth settlement settled into contemplative silence. The abundance of their harvest stores promised security through the coming winter, but thoughtful leaders on both sides understood the deeper currents flowing beneath their success. This feast would be remembered, mythologized, transformed into something far different from what actually occurred. But tonight, under the star-filled New England sky, it was simply what it was, neighbors sharing food and hope. The morning after the feast dawned gray and cold, autumn surrendering to winter's approach. Families on both sides woke with full bellies and grateful hearts, but also with the sobering awareness that this moment of harmony was precious precisely because it was fragile. As frost touched the edges of harvested fields and geese called overhead in their southern migration, the first Thanksgiving passed into memory, carrying with it all the complexity that simple retellings would forever struggle to capture. Chapter 4: Ebbing Peace, Rising Shadows. The years following that first harvest feast seemed golden, a time when two worlds had found harmony along the Massachusetts shoreline. Yet beneath this surface tranquility, something was shifting. The settlers' children played near Wampanoag villages. Trade flowed freely between communities, but careful observers noticed subtle changes. New faces arrived on English ships each season, bringing different attitudes, different expectations. The delicate balance that Massasoit and the Plymouth leaders had crafted was slowly beginning to fray. Massasoit watched these changes with the wisdom of someone who had lived through many seasons of human nature. He understood that peace, like the tide itself, had its own natural rhythm of ebb and flow. The younger English colonists who arrived each spring didn't carry the same desperate gratitude as those first survivors. They hadn't endured that brutal winter, hadn't felt their very existence depend on Wampanoag kindness. These newcomers saw abundance where their predecessors had seen only struggle, and abundance breeds different expectations entirely. The original Plymouth settlers tried to bridge these growing differences, explaining to the newcomers the delicate protocols that had kept peace alive. They shared stories of Squanto's interventions, of Samoset's unexpected friendship, of the careful diplomacy that had transformed potential enemies into essential allies. But stories, no matter how earnestly told, could never replicate lived experience. The new arrivals nodded politely at these tales, then proceeded with their own assumptions about how relations with indigenous peoples should unfold. The foundation of mutual respect was slowly being undermined. Land became the invisible thread that would eventually unravel everything. In Wampanoag understanding, land was sacred, a living entity that sustained all creatures in careful balance. It could be shared, respected, worked in harmony, but never truly owned by any individual. The English brought a completely different philosophy, one where land could be divided, purchased, possessed entirely. These weren't simply different approaches to property. They were fundamentally incompatible ways of understanding humanity's relationship with the earth itself. The seeds of future conflict were quietly taking root. Subtle changes appeared in everyday interactions between the communities. Where once English settlers had approached Wampanoag Sachems with careful deference, newer arrivals sometimes displayed casual dismissiveness. Trade negotiations that had previously been conducted with elaborate courtesy began to take on sharper edges. Wampanoag leaders noticed these shifts, filing them away in their collective memory like storm clouds gathering on a distant horizon. The younger generation of both cultures, who had grown up during peacetime, couldn't fully understand why their elders seemed increasingly troubled by these minor changes. Massasoit's own position within Wampanoag society became more complex as the years passed. His alliance with Plymouth had brought undeniable benefits: protection from traditional enemies, access to valuable trade goods, a buffer against other European encroachments. But some voices within his confederation began questioning whether these advantages were worth the growing complications. Younger warriors spoke of maintaining independence, of not becoming too dependent on English friendship. The great Sachem found himself navigating not just external diplomacy, but internal tensions within his own people. The children of both communities became living symbols of how much had changed and how much hadn't. Young Wampanoag and English children played together during trade gatherings, learned fragments of each other's languages, shared games and stories across cultural boundaries. Yet their parents watched these innocent friendships with increasingly complicated feelings. What had once seemed like beautiful evidence of successful integration now raised questions about cultural preservation, about identity, about what would happen when these children became adults in a world where the balance of power was clearly shifting. Religious differences, initially managed through polite mutual tolerance, began to surface more prominently as English settlements expanded. Puritan ministers spoke more frequently about converting indigenous peoples to Christianity, viewing this as a moral imperative rather than a personal choice. Wampanoag spiritual leaders observed these evangelical efforts with growing concern, recognizing them as attempts to undermine the very foundations of their worldview. What the English characterized as salvation, the Wampanoag increasingly understood as cultural erasure disguised as spiritual guidance. The theological divide was widening. Trade relationships, once characterized by mutual benefit and careful reciprocity, began to favor English interests more heavily. European manufactured goods, metal tools, firearms, textiles had become essential to Wampanoag daily life. This created a subtle but significant dependency that shifted the balance of power in negotiations. English traders recognized this advantage, sometimes exploiting it in ways that would have been unthinkable during those first desperate years when colonist survival depended entirely on indigenous goodwill. The economic foundation of the relationship was quietly but dramatically transforming. Massasoits' diplomatic meetings with Plymouth leaders took on a different tenor as these tensions accumulated. Conversations that had once flowed with easy friendship now required more careful navigation. Both sides still maintained the forms of their alliance, the ritual exchanges, the ceremonial respect, but everyone could feel the underlying strain. Like old friends who had grown apart but continued to meet out of habit, both Wampanoag and English leaders found themselves working harder to maintain connections that had once felt natural and effortless. New English settlements began appearing beyond Plymouth's original boundaries, each one requiring fresh negotiations about land use and territorial boundaries. These weren't the desperate refugees who had nearly perished in their first winter. These were confident colonists who arrived expecting success, demanding accommodation rather than requesting assistance. Each new settlement represented another small shift in the demographic balance, another step toward English numerical superiority, another reason for Wampanoag leaders to question whether their alliance with Plymouth still served their people's long-term interests. The seasonal cycles that had once marked collaborative activities, planting seasons shared between communities, harvest celebrations that brought both peoples together, began to feel more forced. English agricultural practices were changing the landscape in ways that affected traditional Wampanoag activities. Forest clearings for European-style farming disrupted hunting patterns, new crops altered soil conditions, livestock introduced complications to indigenous food systems. These weren't deliberately hostile acts, but their cumulative effect was to make the land itself feel less familiar, less accommodating to traditional ways of life. Communication between the communities, once facilitated by individuals like Squanto, who could bridge both worlds, became more dependent on formal interpreters and official channels. The intimate personal relationships that had characterized early English Wampanoag interactions were gradually being replaced by more institutional, more distant forms of diplomacy. Trust that had been built through individual friendships was slowly giving way to treaty obligations and formal agreements. The human dimension that had made peace possible was being bureaucratized, systematized, and in the process, somehow diminished. Other indigenous groups watched the evolving Plymouth Wampanoag relationship with keen interest. Some saw Massasoit's alliance as a successful adaptation to changing circumstances, a way to maintain sovereignty while benefiting from European trade and protection. Others viewed it as a dangerous precedent, a first step toward cultural submission and eventual displacement. These differing perspectives created new pressures within the broader indigenous political landscape, forcing Wampanoag leaders to consider not just their relationship with the English, but their standing among their own confederated peoples. By the mid 1630s, the relationship between Plymouth and the Wampanoag Confederation had evolved into something far more complex than either simple friendship or outright hostility. It was a careful dance of mutual dependence and growing mistrust, of shared interests and diverging visions for the future. Both communities had been transformed by their decade of coexistence. Neither could return to their pre-contact ways of life, yet neither had found a terribly satisfactory way forward. The stage was being set for more dramatic changes, for harder choices, for the next chapter of this unfolding story. As this chapter of our story closes, imagine the weight of accumulated small changes, the way individual moments of friction can build toward larger transformations. Massasoit and the Plymouth leaders still met in council, still exchanged gifts and courtesies, still maintained the forms of their alliance, but everyone could feel the tension building, like the taut strings of a harpsichord wound too tightly, ready to snap at the slightest additional pressure. The golden years of easy cooperation were drawing to a close, and both communities sensed that greater challenges lay ahead. Chapter 5, Tinderbox, War's Inevitable Spark. As autumn winds carried whispers through the colonial settlements, tensions simmered beneath the surface like coals waiting to ignite. The delicate balance between English colonists and indigenous peoples had grown increasingly fragile, strained by misunderstandings, broken promises, and competing visions of the land. What began as cautious cooperation was slowly transforming into something far more dangerous, a powder keg of cultural collision that would soon explode into devastating conflict. The seeds of discord had been planted years earlier through seemingly innocent misunderstandings that grew into deep-rooted resentments. English settlers viewed land as property to be owned, divided and sold, while indigenous communities saw it as a living entity to be shared and protected. These fundamentally different worldviews created an invisible fault line running through every treaty, every trade agreement, every attempt at peaceful coexistence, a philosophical chasm that would prove impossible to bridge. Trade disputes became the first sparks in this tinderbox of tension. What had once been mutually beneficial exchanges of goods slowly transformed into sources of conflict as English merchants grew increasingly aggressive in their dealings. Native communities found themselves pressured to provide more furs, more land access, more concessions, while receiving less respect, less fair compensation, and less consideration for their traditional ways of life. Trust eroded with each broken agreement. Religious conversion efforts added another layer of friction to an already volatile situation. Puritan ministers believed they were saving souls, but their zealous attempts to transform indigenous spiritual practices often felt like cultural erasure to native communities. Sacred ceremonies were labeled as devil worship, traditional healing practices dismissed as superstition. The very foundation of indigenous identity came under assault, disguised as salvation, but experienced as profound violation and disrespect. Land disputes escalated from minor disagreements to major flashpoints of conflict. English settlers continued expanding their settlements, clearing forests, building fences, and claiming territories that indigenous communities had used for generations. Traditional hunting grounds disappeared behind property lines. Sacred sites became private plots. Each surveyor's stake driven into the ground felt like another wound in the earth, another step toward inevitable confrontation between two incompatible ways of life. The younger generation on both sides grew increasingly frustrated with their elders' attempts at diplomacy. Young English colonists saw native peoples as obstacles to their manifest destiny, while young indigenous warriors viewed the settlers as invaders who would never stop taking. These generational tensions added fuel to an already smoldering fire, as patience wore thin and moderate voices were increasingly drowned out by calls for more aggressive action. Alcohol became another destructive force in this deteriorating relationship. English traders used rum and other spirits as bargaining tools, knowing that alcohol could cloud judgment and make negotiations easier to manipulate. But the introduction of these substances also created social problems within indigenous communities, leading to conflicts, health issues, and further breakdown of traditional social structures. What was intended as a trade good became a weapon of cultural destruction. Legal systems clashed as fundamentally as spiritual beliefs and land concepts. English colonial courts operated under written laws and individual rights, while indigenous communities relied on consensus building, oral traditions, and collective responsibility. When disputes arose, neither side could truly understand or accept the other's approach to justice, leading to a sense that fairness was impossible and that force might be the only language both sides could understand. The arrival of new waves of settlers accelerated the timeline toward conflict. Each ship that arrived at Plymouth brought more mouths to feed, more families seeking land, more pressure on already strained resources. Indigenous communities watched their world shrink with each new homestead, each cleared field, each built fence. The mathematical reality became undeniable. There simply wasn't enough space for both ways of life to coexist peacefully in the same territory. Communication breakdowns multiplied as stakes grew higher and trust diminished. Translation errors led to misunderstood treaties. Cultural misinterpretations created unintended insults. What one side saw as generous compromise, the other experienced as unreasonable demand. Language barriers became emotional barriers, and emotional barriers hardened into permanent walls. The very tools needed for peace, honest dialogue, and mutual understanding seemed to slip further from reach with each passing season. Economic pressures from England added another layer of complexity to colonial relationships with indigenous peoples. Plymouth settlers faced constant demands from investors back home, pressure to produce profitable returns on their colonial investment, and this economic urgency made colonists less patient with traditional indigenous decision-making processes, less willing to respect seasonal hunting patterns, less able to accept that some things couldn't be rushed or commodified according to English business schedules. Disease continued to devastate indigenous populations, creating power imbalances that further destabilized relationships. Entire villages weakened by smallpox and other epidemics became vulnerable to English expansion, and while survivors struggled with grief, displacement, and the breakdown of their traditional social structures. Some colonists saw these epidemics as divine providence, clearing the way for their settlements, an attitude that indigenous peoples found deeply offensive and threatening. Military alliances began forming on both sides as peaceful coexistence seemed increasingly impossible. English settlers started forming militias and building fortifications, while indigenous communities began reaching out to other tribes, seeking strength and unity against the common threat of colonial expansion. These preparations for war created a self-fulfilling prophecy, as each side's defensive measures were interpreted by the other side as evidence of aggressive intentions and hostile planning. Individual incidents began escalating into broader conflicts as goodwill eroded and suspicion grew. A disputed trade deal became evidence of systematic cheating. A hunting accident was interpreted as deliberate aggression. Small misunderstandings that might once have been resolved through careful diplomacy now became flashpoints for larger tensions, as both communities found themselves increasingly quick to assume the worst about the other's motivations and intentions. The final sparks that would ignite this carefully constructed tinderbox were already beginning to glow in the gathering darkness. Moderate voices on both sides found themselves increasingly marginalized as fear and anger grew stronger than hope and understanding. The stage was set for a conflict that would transform the relationship between English colonists and indigenous peoples forever, leaving scars that would echo through generations of American history. As we close this chapter, picture those embers glowing in the autumn darkness, each one representing a broken promise, a misunderstood gesture, a fear grown too large for words to contain. The inevitable war approaches like a storm on the horizon, casting long shadows over the land where gratitude and cooperation once bloomed. Sometimes the most tragic conflicts arise not from evil intentions, but from the simple, heartbreaking inability of different worlds to coexist peacefully. Chapter 6: King Philip's War. A Flame Extinguished. The autumn of 1675 arrived with an ominous chill, as tensions that had been simmering for decades finally erupted into open warfare. Metacom, known to the colonists as King Philip, watched from his stronghold as his world began to fracture. The brittle leaves whispered of coming sorrow, of a conflict that would forever change the landscape of New England and leave scars that time could never fully heal. From the indigenous perspective, this was not merely a war, but a desperate struggle for survival itself. Metacom had witnessed his people's hunting grounds carved up, their sacred sites desecrated, their children pulled away to colonial schools. The breaking point came when 3 Wampanoag men were executed by Plymouth authorities, their death sparking a flame that would consume everything in its path, igniting a conflict born of decades of accumulated grievances and broken promises. The war began in the summer of 1675, but its roots stretched back to the very first moments of colonial contact. Indigenous communities had watched their population decimated by disease, their political autonomy steadily eroded, their traditional ways of life systematically dismantled. What the colonists called rebellion, the native peoples understood as a last stand against cultural extinction, a final attempt to preserve what remained of their ancestral homeland and sacred traditions. Metacom formed a confederation unlike anything New England had seen before, uniting tribes that had historically been enemies. The Wampanoag, Nipmuc, and Narragansett peoples put aside ancient rivalries, bound together by a common threat to their very existence. This alliance represented more than military strategy. It was a profound act of cultural preservation, a desperate attempt to maintain indigenous sovereignty in a world increasingly dominated by European colonial ambitions and expanding settlements. The early months of the war saw remarkable indigenous victories as coordinated attacks struck colonial settlements throughout Massachusetts and Rhode Island. Native warriors employed guerrilla tactics perfected over generations, moving silently through forests they knew intimately, striking swiftly before melting back into the wilderness. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that the tide of colonization might actually be reversed, that indigenous peoples might reclaim their ancestral territories through force of arms. But the colonists possessed advantages that would prove decisive: superior numbers, advanced weaponry, and most crucially, indigenous allies who had chosen to side with the English. The Mohegan and Pequot peoples, longtime enemies of the Wampanoag, provided crucial intelligence and military support to colonial forces. This division within indigenous communities created fractures that weakened the Confederation, turning what might have been a unified resistance into a fractured struggle plagued by internal conflicts and competing loyalties. As winter approached, the war's toll became increasingly evident on both sides. Colonial towns lay in ruins, their inhabitants fled or dead, while indigenous communities faced starvation and disease. The traditional seasonal patterns that had sustained native peoples for generations were disrupted by constant warfare, making it impossible to hunt, fish, or gather in familiar territories. Both populations found themselves trapped in a cycle of violence that seemed to offer no path toward resolution or peace. The Great Swamp Fight of December 1675 marked a turning point in the conflict when colonial forces launched a devastating winter assault on a fortified Narragansett village. What followed was not a battle, but a massacre, as hundreds of indigenous civilians, including women and children, perished in the flames. The attack violated traditional rules of warfare that both cultures had previously observed, crossing a moral boundary that would haunt the conscience of New England for generations to come. Spring brought desperation to the Indigenous Confederation as food stores dwindled and safe havens disappeared. Metacom's forces found themselves increasingly isolated, cut off from traditional allies and supply routes. Colonial forces, now joined by hundreds of indigenous auxiliaries, pressed their advantage relentlessly, using tactics of total warfare that targeted not just warriors, but the entire infrastructure of native society, destroying villages, crops, and sacred sites with systematic thoroughness that left little hope for recovery. The summer of 1676 witnessed the gradual collapse of indigenous resistance, as one community after another was forced to surrender or flee. Many native families sought refuge with distant relatives, while others attempted to blend into colonial society as servants or laborers. The psychological toll was immense, as survivors witnessed the complete destruction of social structures that had sustained their people for countless generations, leaving them adrift in a world that no longer recognized their humanity or their rights. Metacom himself became increasingly isolated, moving from one temporary refuge to another as colonial forces closed in. The man once known as a skilled diplomat and charismatic leader found himself reduced to a fugitive, dependent on the loyalty of a shrinking band of followers. His transformation from respected sachem to hunted outlaw reflected the broader tragedy of indigenous leadership during this period, as traditional authority structures crumbled under the pressure of colonial expansion and military defeat. On August 12, 1676, Metacom was killed by indigenous allies of the colonists, his death marking the symbolic end of organized resistance. Colonial authorities displayed his severed head on a pike in Plymouth, where it remained for 20 years, a grim reminder of the price of opposing English expansion. This act of public humiliation revealed the depth of colonial fear and hatred, transforming a former diplomatic partner into a demonized symbol of savage rebellion that justified the complete subjugation of native peoples. The war's aftermath brought unspeakable suffering to indigenous communities throughout New England. Surviving native peoples were sold into slavery, their children separated from families and sent to distant colonies or the Caribbean. Those who remained faced systematic dispossession as colonial authorities seized traditional territories under the pretext of conquest. The social fabric that had sustained indigenous civilization for millennia was torn apart, leaving survivors to rebuild their identities from fragments of memory and tradition. Yet, even in defeat, indigenous peoples demonstrated remarkable resilience and cultural persistence. Secret ceremonies continued in hidden locations. Traditional stories were passed down through whispered conversations, and sacred knowledge was preserved by elders who risked everything to maintain connections to ancestral wisdom. This underground resistance represented a different kind of warfare, a battle for cultural survival that would continue long after the last military engagement, ensuring that indigenous voices would never be completely silenced, despite colonial attempts at cultural genocide. The colonists' victory came at an enormous cost, leaving communities traumatized and financially devastated. Many English settlers struggled to reconcile their Christian beliefs with the brutal tactics they had employed, while others rationalized the violence as divine judgment against heathen peoples. The war created psychological scars that would influence colonial attitudes toward indigenous peoples for generations, establishing patterns of fear, mistrust, and dehumanization that would shape American expansion policies for centuries to come. As autumn leaves fell once again, New England faced a transformed landscape where the ancient balance between indigenous and colonial peoples had been forever shattered. The silence that followed King Philip's War was not peace, but the hollow quiet of a world diminished, where the voices of countless generations had been reduced to whispers on the wind. Yet in that silence, if you listen carefully, you can still hear the echo of their stories, waiting to be remembered, waiting to be honored with the dignity they always deserved. Chapter 7: Reconstructions and Remembrances. The post-war colonial landscape stretched before survivors like a patchwork quilt of shattered dreams and stubborn hope. Where once stood thriving settlements, now only foundations remained, scattered stones marking where families had gathered around hearths. The rumble of reconstruction echoed through valleys where laughter once filled autumn evenings. Memory, that most fragile of human constructs, began its slow work of rebuilding not just homes, but entire narratives of what had been. In the aftermath of King Philip's War, colonial communities faced a peculiar challenge. How do you rebuild not just structures, but stories? How do you tell children about neighbors who once shared harvest meals but became enemies across battle lines? The very ground beneath their feet held memories too painful to acknowledge, yet too important to forget. Reconstruction meant more than laying new timber, it meant crafting new truths from the fragments of old ones. The Massachusetts Bay Colony's records from 1676 onward reveal a fascinating phenomenon. Official documents began omitting certain details, certain names, certain uncomfortable truths about pre-war relationships. Where once town records mentioned indigenous trading partners by name, now they appeared only as distant threats. This wasn't accidental. It was the careful architecture of collective amnesia, building new foundations on deliberately forgotten ground. creating space for more palatable memories to take root. Plymouth's children grew up hearing stories their grandparents never would have told. The narrative shifted, softened, becoming something more digestible for young minds seeking heroes and villains in stark contrast. Indigenous peoples who had once been neighbors, trading partners, even friends, were slowly transformed in the telling into distant others. Memory, like clay in a potter's hands, was reshaped to serve the needs of those doing the remembering rather than honoring those being remembered. The process of mythologizing began almost immediately. Ministers preached of divine providence, of chosen people surviving trials in a promised land. What had been a complex web of relationships, negotiations, cultural exchange, and tragic misunderstandings became simplified into a story of pilgrims versus wilderness, civilization versus savagery. The nuances disappeared like morning mist, leaving behind sharp edges where once there had been gentle curves of understanding, friendship, and shared humanity. Yet some memories refused to be rebuilt. In quiet moments, when old settlers sat by their fires, fragments of the real past would surface. They remembered Massasoit's dignity, Squanto's generosity, the laughter that had once filled harvest celebrations. These memories lived in whispers, in stories told only to trusted ears, in the spaces between official histories. Truth, it seems, has a way of surviving even the most determined efforts to bury it beneath more convenient narratives. The reconstruction of colonial towns followed patterns that revealed deeper truths about reconstruction of memory. Streets that had once led to indigenous villages were simply abandoned, left to be reclaimed by forest. New roads were built, leading only to other English settlements, creating physical networks that reflected the mental networks being constructed in collective consciousness. The landscape itself became a map of selective remembering, pathways to some memories deliberately overgrown, others carefully maintained. Children born after the war grew up in a world where Thanksgiving was already becoming mythology. They learned of pilgrims and Indians, but not of Massasoits, political acumen, not of Squanto's tragic history as a kidnapping survivor, not of the complex negotiations that made that first feast possible. The story was simplified, sanitized, made suitable for teaching moral lessons rather than historical truths. Complexity, it seemed, was the first casualty of memory's reconstruction. The grim outer edges of winning and losing revealed themselves in unexpected ways. Colonial survivors discovered that victory, when it comes at such cost, tastes remarkably like defeat. The land they had fought to keep was forever changed, haunted by ghosts of relationships that might have been. Indigenous communities faced not just physical displacement, but the deeper wound of being erased from the very stories of their homelands, becoming strangers in narratives about their own territories. What does it mean to win when the victory requires forgetting half of what made the struggle meaningful? The colonists had wanted security, prosperity, the right to practice their faith freely. But in achieving these goals, they had lost something harder to name, the possibility of a different kind of Thanksgiving, one that honored all the hands that had made their survival possible. Victory, they learned, sometimes means mourning what you had to sacrifice to achieve it. For Indigenous survivors, losing meant something entirely different. It wasn't just land or political autonomy. It was the slow realization that their very presence in their homelands would be rewritten, minimized, mythologized beyond recognition. They watched as their ancestors became characters in someone else's story, their sacred places renamed, their contributions to colonial survival forgotten or attributed to divine intervention rather than human generosity. Loss for them was measured in erasures rather than graves. The folklore that emerged from this period reveals the psychological work that memory does when reality becomes too heavy to bear. Stories began to appear of friendly Indians who disappeared mysteriously, of providential harvests that ignored the indigenous agricultural knowledge that made them possible, of pilgrims surviving wilderness through faith alone rather than through the guidance of people who had lived there for thousands of years. Folklore, it seems, is memory's way of finding peace with uncomfortable truths. As years passed, the reconstruction of memory became so complete that even the reconstructors forgot what they had changed. The second generation of post war colonists grew up believing their simplified stories were historical fact. They taught their children about pilgrims and Indians without knowing they were teaching mythology rather than history. Memory, once reconstructed, has a way of presenting itself as eternal truth, making forgetting invisible to those who have inherited its consequences. Yet time, that great teacher, offers its own lessons about memory and truth. As we drift through centuries of accumulated stories, we begin to see how memory's reconstruction serves psychological needs even as it betrays historical accuracy. Communities need stories they can live with, myths that help them sleep at night, narratives that justify the choices their ancestors made. The challenge lies not in condemning this very human tendency, but in acknowledging it, in learning to hold multiple truths simultaneously. Perhaps the most profound reconstruction happens not in the past, but in the present moment, when we allow ourselves to sit with complexity, to hold space for multiple perspectives, to let our understanding of Thanksgiving expand beyond the mythologies we inherited. Memory, we discover, is not fixed, not finished, but always available for re examination, always capable of healing when approached with courage and compassion. The stories we tell ourselves can change, and in changing, they can heal. As this chapter of reconstructions and remembrances draws to a close, we find ourselves standing at the threshold of deeper understanding. Time's passage has shown us that memory is not a monument, but a river, always flowing, always carrying new tributaries of insight. Healing becomes possible when we stop defending reconstructed memories and start honoring the complexity of what actually happened. In this space of honest remembrance, we prepare for the next chapter of our journey together. Chapter 8: Evolution of a Feast. Thanksgiving's Rebirth. The pages of history begin to turn more rapidly now, as we witness how a scattered collection of colonial memories transformed into something entirely new. Historians would soon take hold of these fragmented stories, weaving them together like threads in a tapestry, creating the mythology that would bind a young nation together through shared gratitude and common purpose. In the decades following those early colonial encounters, something remarkable began to happen. The harsh realities of survival, the complex relationships between settlers and indigenous peoples, the struggles and compromises, all of this began to fade into softer focus. What emerged instead was a gentler story, one of unity and thanksgiving, one that a growing nation desperately needed to believe about itself and its origins. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but rather through countless retellings, each one smoothing away the rough edges of history. Writers and orators began crafting narratives of peaceful cooperation, of grateful pilgrims sharing their bounty, of indigenous peoples welcoming newcomers with open arms. These stories spread like seeds on the wind, taking root in the collective imagination, growing into the mythologized version we recognize today. Sarah Josepha Hale emerges as a central figure in this evolution, the editor of Godey's Lady's Book, who spent decades advocating for a national Thanksgiving holiday. Through her pen, she painted vivid pictures of family gatherings, of tables laden with turkey and pumpkin pie, of a tradition that could unite North and South, East and West, in shared gratitude and common celebration of American abundance. Her vision was both simple and profound, Thanksgiving as the great unifier, a holiday that transcended regional differences and political divisions. She wrote letters to presidents, published essays and stories, and gradually built momentum for her cause. Her persistence would eventually reach Abraham Lincoln, who in 1863 would declare Thanksgiving a national holiday, forever changing how America remembered its earliest feast of gratitude. Lincoln's proclamation came during the darkest days of the Civil War, when the nation was literally tearing itself apart. His call for Thanksgiving was both an act of faith and a plea for unity, asking Americans to remember their blessings even in the midst of unimaginable suffering. The timing was no accident. Thanksgiving became a balm for a wounded nation, a reminder of better times and brighter possibilities. As the holiday took hold, the stories grew ever more romanticized. The harsh winter that killed half the Plymouth colonists, the complex political negotiations with Massasoit, the years of tension and misunderstanding, all of this faded into the background. What remained was the image of a harmonious feast, pilgrims and Indians sharing turkey and corn, gratitude flowing freely around a bountiful table set in the wilderness. Artists began painting these idealized scenes, their brushstrokes creating the visual vocabulary of American Thanksgiving. Norman Rockwell would later perfect this imagery, his warm domestic scenes becoming the gold standard for how the holiday should look and feel. But these artistic interpretations drew as much from imagination as from historical record, creating a Thanksgiving that was more aspirational than actual, more myth than memory. The culinary traditions we associate with Thanksgiving also evolved during this period, turkey becoming the centerpiece, not because it was historically accurate, but because it was uniquely American. Cranberry sauce, sweet potatoes, pumpkin pie, these dishes were woven into the narrative, creating a distinctly American feast that differed markedly from anything the original colonists might have recognized or prepared. Schools became powerful vehicles for transmitting these newly crafted traditions, children learning simplified versions of the Thanksgiving story through pageants and plays. Generation after generation of American students would don paper pilgrim hats and feathered headbands, reenacting a version of history that prioritized harmony over complexity, celebration over struggle, unity over the messier realities of cultural encounter and colonial expansion. The department stores and advertisers soon discovered Thanksgiving's commercial potential, promoting the holiday as the perfect opportunity for family reunions and elaborate feasts. Marketing campaigns emphasized abundance, gratitude, and the importance of gathering around the table. The holiday became simultaneously more commercialized and more sentimentalized, its historical roots growing ever more distant from its contemporary celebrations and commercial expressions. Yet beneath this manufactured mythology, indigenous voices continued to tell different stories. For many Native Americans, Thanksgiving represented not celebration, but mourning, a reminder of what was lost rather than what was gained. Their perspectives remained largely absent from mainstream narratives, their experiences relegated to footnotes, while the dominant culture embraced its simplified and sanitized version of early American history. The 20th century saw Thanksgiving become thoroughly institutionalized, its date fixed by presidential proclamation, its traditions codified by popular culture. Parades and football games joined turkey and stuffing as essential elements, creating a holiday that bore little resemblance to those early harvest celebrations. Thanksgiving had become something entirely new, a uniquely American creation that served present needs more than historical accuracy. Modern historians have worked to complicate these simple narratives, revealing the tensions and contradictions that the mythologized version obscured. Their research has uncovered the complex realities of colonial life, the sophisticated political systems of indigenous peoples, and the gradual transformation of mutual cooperation into conflict and displacement. Yet these scholarly corrections struggle to compete with centuries of embedded storytelling and cherished family traditions. Today's Thanksgiving thus represents a fascinating cultural phenomenon, a holiday that reveals as much about American identity as about American history. It shows how nations create meaning through selective memory, how complicated pasts get simplified into manageable narratives, how myths can become more powerful than facts when they serve deep psychological and social needs for belonging, unity, and shared purpose. As we gather around our own tables, sharing turkey and gratitude, we participate in this ongoing evolution. Thanksgiving continues to change, incorporating new voices, new perspectives, new understandings of what it means to give thanks. Perhaps that ongoing transformation, that willingness to reimagine and reinterpret, is itself the most authentic tradition we can inherit from those first uncertain feasts shared so long ago in the Massachusetts wilderness. Chapter 9: A Shared Table, the Modern Feast. Picture the familiar scene unfolding across millions of homes today. The aroma of roasting turkey fills the air. Families gather from distant places. Children's laughter echoes through hallways. While we've traveled through centuries of complex history, tonight we arrive at the Thanksgiving we know, the rituals that comfort us, the traditions that feel eternal, yet carry whispers of their forgotten origins. In kitchens across America, the ancient dance begins anew. Hands knead stuffing with recipes passed down through generations. Some families swear by cornbread, others by bread cubes soaked in sage. The ritual connects us to countless mothers and grandmothers who stirred similar bowls, whispered similar prayers, created similar moments of anticipation. Each ingredient carries memory, each technique holds love, each tradition a bridge across time. The turkey, centerpiece of our modern feast, sits golden and glistening. But do you know why this bird became our symbol? In the early 1600s, wild turkeys roamed New England forests. Native peoples had hunted them for centuries. The Wampanoag called them Naham. They provided not just meat, but feathers for ceremonies, bones for tools. The European colonists, initially unfamiliar with this strange bird, slowly embraced what the land offered. Around the table, cranberry sauce glistens like ruby jewels. These tart berries grew wild in Massachusetts bogs. The Wampanoag called them sassamanash. They mixed them with venison and fat to create pemmican. Early colonists found them too sour until they learned to sweeten them with maple syrup. Today's jellied cylinder from a can bears little resemblance to those original bog berries, yet the tradition persists, sweet and tart memories combined. Mashed potatoes, creamy and comforting, seem so traditional, so essential, yet potatoes didn't exist in North America when the Pilgrims landed. These South American natives arrived much later. The indigenous peoples of 1621 shared corn, beans, and squash, the three sisters that sustained their civilization. Sweet potatoes, yams, these too came from distant lands. Our modern table, a fusion of continents, a testament to centuries of cultural blending. Morning arrives with the thunder of parades. Giant balloons float through city streets. Marching bands play familiar songs. Millions watch from couches, hot coffee in hand. This spectacle began in the 1920s when department stores created moving advertisements. Macy's transformed Thanksgiving into theater. The indigenous peoples who once walked these same paths now appear as costume characters, their complex history reduced to colorful floats, drifting past cheering crowds. Each family weaves their own sacred rituals. Some say grace in whispered reverence, others share what they're grateful for around the circle, voices soft and sincere. Children fidget in their chairs, eyes on the dessert table. Adults remember similar moments from their own childhood. The ritual of gratitude, ancient as humanity itself, finds new expression in living rooms, dining rooms, wherever people gather to remember their blessings. The dining table stretches to accommodate everyone, extra leaves inserted, mismatched chairs gathered from every room. Grandmother's china emerges from tissue paper. The good silverware catches candlelight. Cloth napkins, rarely used, feel formal and special. This careful preparation, this attention to beauty, echoes ancient human needs to mark important moments, to transform ordinary meals into something sacred, something worthy of remembrance, something beautiful enough for gratitude. Laughter bubbles up between courses. Uncle tells the same story every year. Cousins compare notes on college life. Children perform impromptu entertainment. The conversation flows like warm honey, binding the generations together. These moments of connection, of belonging, mirror gatherings throughout human history, when tribes shared their harvest, celebrated survival, honored the bonds that kept them strong. The food nourishes bodies, but the laughter, the stories, these nourish souls. As dessert appears, pumpkin pie crowned with whipped cream, apple crisps steaming from the oven, the feast reaches its crescendo. Pumpkins, another gift from indigenous peoples who grew them alongside corn and beans. They carved them, dried them, used every part. The pie we know, sweetened with sugar, spiced with cinnamon, represents centuries of cultural exchange. Each bite carries the memory of hands that first cultivated these orange gourds in New England soil. The wishbone tradition unfolds with childlike ceremony. Two people pull, make a wish, await the snap. This custom traveled from ancient Rome, where people believed birds carried messages from gods. Breaking the wishbone, the furcula supposedly granted the holder's desire. Children approach this ritual with utmost seriousness, eyes closed, hearts full of hope. While the bone may not hold magic, the moment of shared believing, of innocent faith, creates its own kind of wonder. Evening settles softly over the feast, plates emptied, bellies full, conversations growing drowsy. The kitchen holds evidence of the day's labor, pots and pans, serving dishes, the beautiful chaos of generous hospitality. Leftovers promise tomorrow's comfort, turkey sandwiches, soup from the bones. These remnants, like the holiday itself, will nourish for days to come. The work of preparation, the joy of sharing, the satisfaction of abundance, all blending into contentment. Football plays on television, voices rising and falling with the game. Some doze in comfortable chairs, others walk in the crisp autumn air. The day moves toward its gentle close. Children play with new toys. Adults sink into post-feast lethargy. This peaceful afternoon, this sense of time suspended, mirrors the original harvest celebrations, when communities paused their daily labor to acknowledge abundance, to rest in gratitude, to simply be present with those they loved most. As twilight deepens, families begin their departures. Hugs linger longer than usual. Containers of leftovers change hands. Plans for Christmas, promises to call more often. The rituals of goodbye, laden with love and turkey, carry the weight of temporary separation, yet something has been renewed, some ancient bond strengthened. The table that brought them together will hold the memory of this day, this gathering, this moment of belonging, until they return again. In the quiet aftermath, as dishes soak and candles burn low, the house holds the warmth of celebration. The tradition we've inherited, complex and layered, beautiful and problematic, continues to evolve. Each family, each gathering, each shared meal adds new threads to the tapestry. We cannot change the tangled history, but we can choose how to honor both the light and shadow of this American story with honesty, with humility, with hope. Tonight, as sleep approaches and grateful hearts rest easy, we carry forward the best of this tradition. The impulse to gather, to share, to give thanks transcends historical complexity. It speaks to something essential in human nature, the need for community, for gratitude, for celebration. The modern feast, with all its imperfections, still offers us this gift, this moment of pause, this opportunity to count our blessings and rest in the warmth of love shared around a table. Chapter 10. Remember Forgotten Voices, Indigenous Narratives. In the gentle shadows of our Thanksgiving story, there exist voices that have been whispered rather than heard, stories that have been marginalized rather than celebrated. Tonight, we honor those whose lands welcomed the first settlers, whose wisdom guided survival through harsh winters, whose resilience echoes through generations. These are the voices that deserve our quiet attention, our respectful listening, as we uncover truths hidden beneath familiar tales. Long before the Mayflower touched these shores, the Wampanoag people had thrived here for thousands of years. Their sophisticated understanding of seasons, their intricate knowledge of land and sea, their complex social structures and governance systems all flourished in harmony with nature. Massasoit, their great sachem, led his people with wisdom that extended far beyond simple survival. His decisions would shape the destiny of two worlds, creating bridges between vastly different ways of life. When those weary English settlers stumbled ashore, facing a winter that promised death, it was indigenous hands that offered life. Squanto, whose own story bears unimaginable trauma, became their translator and guide. Sold into slavery years earlier, escaped across an ocean, returned to find his entire village vanished to disease. Yet still, he chose compassion over bitterness, teaching strangers to plant corn, to tap maple trees, to read the language of this ancient land. The first harvest celebration was not the quaint gathering our textbooks describe, but a complex diplomatic gathering. When the Pilgrims fired their muskets in celebration, Massasoit arrived with 90 warriors, not as party guests, but as concerned neighbors investigating potential hostility. What followed was 3 days of careful negotiation, shared meals, and cautious alliance building. Two cultures, each trying to understand the other, each making assumptions that would echo through centuries. Indigenous women, whose voices are often the most silenced, were the backbone of their communities. They controlled agriculture, managed trade relationships, held political power in ways European women could barely imagine. Their cornfields fed both peoples that first winter. Their knowledge of food preservation meant survival. Yet in most retellings, they become invisible, reduced to backdrop figures in someone else's narrative. Tonight, we remember their names, their contributions, their essential presence in this shared story. The concept of giving thanks was not foreign to indigenous peoples, but deeply woven into their spiritual fabric. Every season brought ceremonies of gratitude. Every harvest prompted reflection on abundance and responsibility. The earth was not property to be owned, but a relative to be honored. This philosophy, so different from European concepts of land ownership, would become a source of misunderstanding, conflict, and ultimately tragedy. Two worldviews, each valid, each struggling to comprehend the other. As more ships arrived, as more settlers demanded land, the delicate balance began to shift. Indigenous people found themselves caught between accommodation and resistance, between preserving their culture and adapting to survive. Some became intermediaries, bridging two worlds at great personal cost. Others retreated deeper into traditional ways, knowing that change threatened everything their ancestors had built. Each choice carried consequences, each decision rippled through generations, each compromise came at a price. King Philip, Massasoit, son, watched his father's peaceful policies crumble under colonial pressure. Born Metacomet, he witnessed his people's lands shrinking, their sovereignty eroding, their children forbidden to practice traditional ways. When diplomacy failed, when legal treaties proved worthless, he chose war. His resistance, lasting 3 brutal years, was both a desperate fight for survival and a final assertion of indigenous dignity. History often portrays him as savage, but indigenous voices remember him as a protector. The aftermath of King Philip's War devastated indigenous communities, but it did not erase them. Survivors carried forward their languages, their ceremonies, their stories, often in secret, always with determination. Families maintained oral traditions. Elders taught children the old ways. Communities adapted without surrendering their core identity. Through centuries of pressure to assimilate, to forget, to disappear, indigenous voices found ways to persist, to preserve, to remember who they had always been. In boarding schools designed to kill the Indian, to save the man, children were forbidden their names, their languages, their connections to home. Yet even there, in those institutions of cultural erasure, young people found ways to resist, to remember, to carry forward what adults risked everything to preserve. They whispered stories in dormitory darkness. They carried sacred items in hidden pockets. They maintained their identity through acts of quiet rebellion. Each small resistance was a victory. Today, indigenous communities across this continent continue their ancestors' work of cultural preservation. They revitalize endangered languages. They teach traditional ecological knowledge. They maintain ceremonies that connect present generations to ancient wisdom. Thanksgiving, for many indigenous people, is not a celebration, but a day of mourning, a national day of mourning that honors those lost, those silenced, those whose perspectives were written out of the official story. Their voices ask us to listen differently. Contemporary indigenous voices speak with nuance about this complicated history, neither villainizing all settlers nor romanticizing all indigenous people. They ask for recognition, for accurate historical accounting, for respect for sovereign rights that persist despite centuries of challenge. They offer wisdom about sustainable relationships with the land, about community resilience, about maintaining cultural identity while engaging with the modern world. Their perspectives could heal divides if we listen with open hearts. The Wampanoag people still live in Massachusetts, still practice their traditions, still tell their version of that first encounter. Their annual powwows welcome visitors who come to learn, to listen, to understand perspectives that textbooks often ignore. They are not museum pieces, not historical footnotes, but living communities with contemporary concerns, ongoing challenges, and wisdom that could benefit everyone. Their voices invite us into deeper relationship, more honest conversation, more complete understanding. When we center Indigenous voices in our Thanksgiving reflections, we discover richer truths than simple gratitude exercises. We encounter questions about justice, about healing, about what genuine reconciliation might require. We learn that giving thanks is not enough, that acknowledgement without action feels hollow, that true gratitude leads to behavior change. Indigenous wisdom teaches that every gift creates responsibility, that abundance shared multiplies, that remembering the forgotten transforms both listener and speaker. These forgotten voices remind us that history is not a single story, but a symphony of perspectives, each adding essential harmonies to our understanding. When we include all voices, when we honor all experiences, when we create space for all truths, our collective story becomes more complete, more honest, more healing. The whispers become conversations, the margins become centers, the forgotten become remembered. This is what Indigenous voices offer if we have ears to hear. As we prepare to rest, let these Indigenous voices echo in our consciousness, not as guilt or shame, but as invitation to deeper relationship with truth, with justice, with each other. Their resilience inspires, their wisdom guides, their forgiveness challenges. In the quiet of sleep, may we carry their stories, their perspectives, their ongoing presence in this land we share. Tomorrow, may we wake with greater understanding, deeper respect, and renewed commitment to honoring all voices in our common story. Chapter 11, A Day of Mourning. While most Americans prepare their feasts and gather around tables heavy with abundance, another story unfolds in the quiet corners of this nation. A story whispered in sacred circles, carried on ancestral winds. Today, we explore a solemn observance that runs counter to the familiar narrative, the National Day of Mourning. Let your breathing slow as we honor this profound remembrance together. Every fourth Thursday in November, as Thanksgiving celebrations reach their peak across America, a different kind of gathering takes place. Native American communities and their allies come together, not in celebration, but in solemn remembrance. This observance began in 1970, a counter-narrative to the mythologized story of harmony between pilgrims and indigenous peoples. Close your eyes and feel the weight of this untold history. Picture Plymouth Rock on a cold November morning in 1970. Wampanoag leader Wamsuta Frank James had been invited to speak at a state celebration of the 350th anniversary of the Mayflower landing. But when officials read his prepared speech, they demanded he change it. His words spoke truth about genocide, land theft, and broken promises. Instead of compromising his message, he chose silence and sparked something powerful. That rejected speech would become the foundation of the first National Day of Mourning. James gathered with other Native Americans and supporters at Plymouth Rock itself, speaking the words that had been silenced. They honored ancestors who had died from disease, warfare, and displacement. They mourned the loss of millions of acres of homeland. They remembered languages that would never again be spoken by children. As you drift deeper into rest, imagine the profound courage it took to stand at that symbolic rock, to reclaim narrative from those who had written history with their conquerors' pens. The organizers declared that Thanksgiving was not a time for celebration, but for mourning the genocide of Native American peoples. They called it a day to honor survival, to acknowledge ongoing struggles for sovereignty and justice. The gathering was small. That first year, perhaps 50 people standing together in the November chill. But their message carried far beyond that windswept shore. Word spread through indigenous communities, through universities, through circles of those who sought historical truth over comfortable mythology. Each year, the crowds grew larger, their voices stronger, their commitment deeper. Let this history wash over you like gentle waves. Feel the contrast now. On one side, families gathering for turkey dinners, football games, and gratitude lists. On the other, communities standing in circles, sharing stories of ancestors, burning sage, offering prayers for those whose voices were silenced centuries ago. Both observances happen on the same day, in the same country, yet they inhabit completely different emotional landscapes. Breathe deeply and hold space for both truths. The Day of Mourning speakers share statistics that rarely make it into school textbooks. Before European contact, an estimated 15 to 20 million indigenous people lived in what would become the United States. By 1900, that number had dropped to fewer than 250,000. Disease, warfare, forced relocation, and systematic genocide had decimated entire nations. These are not ancient wounds, they are generational traumas that continue to impact communities today. Let your mind settle as we explore what this mourning means. It is not dwelling in bitterness or hatred. Instead, it becomes a form of resistance, a way of ensuring that the full story gets told. Native American organizers speak of honoring their ancestors by refusing to let their suffering be erased or romanticized. They create space for grief that has been suppressed for centuries, grief that needs witnessing. The ceremonies include drumming, prayers in native languages, and the sharing of traditional foods. Elders speak about the importance of passing down true history to younger generations. Children learn about their heritage not through pilgrim mythology, but through the actual experiences of their great great grandparents. These are sacred moments, protected spaces where indigenous identity can flourish without colonial interference. Rest in this reverence and respect. As the years passed, the National Day of Mourning evolved beyond Plymouth Rock. Similar observances began appearing in cities across the country. University campuses hosted teach-ins about indigenous history. Museums created exhibits examining the real impact of colonization. Slowly, quietly, alternative narratives began entering mainstream consciousness. Progress measured not in grand proclamations, but in small moments of recognition and understanding. Feel the profound sadness that lives within this observance, but also notice the strength. Native American communities have survived centuries of attempts to erase them. Their languages, though endangered, still carry ancient wisdom. Their ceremonies, though suppressed, continue in hidden valleys and urban community centers. The Day of Mourning becomes both lament and celebration, mourning what was lost while honoring what endures. Contemporary participants in these gatherings come from many backgrounds. Native Americans stand alongside non-Indigenous allies who seek to understand the full complexity of American history. They gather not to shame those who celebrate Thanksgiving traditionally, but to ensure that multiple perspectives can coexist. They ask for acknowledgement, for truth-telling, for the kind of honest reckoning that makes genuine healing possible. Let this wisdom settle into your dreams. The organizers remind participants that mourning is not the end of the story. They speak of Indigenous resilience, of communities that have maintained their connection to ancestral lands despite centuries of displacement. They celebrate modern Native American artists, activists, and leaders who continue fighting for sovereignty and justice. The Day of Mourning honors the past while working toward a different kind of future, one built on truth rather than mythology. As we prepare to move beyond this chapter, hold space for the complexity we have explored. Thanksgiving and the Day of Mourning need not cancel each other out. They can coexist in our understanding, each adding depth to the American story. Perhaps true gratitude requires acknowledgement of the full cost of our abundance, the recognition that our feast tables were set on foundations built from others' loss and displacement. Let the solemn beauty of this observance carry you into deeper rest. In the quiet spaces of your mind, honor both celebration and mourning, abundance and loss, the complexity of history that refuses simple narratives. The Day of Mourning teaches us that remembering can be an act of love, that truth-telling can be a form of prayer, that acknowledgement becomes the first step towards something approaching justice. Sleep peacefully in this contemplation. Chapter 12. Lessons Learned and Unlearned. As our journey through Thanksgiving's hidden history draws toward its gentle close, we must pause to consider what these revelations truly mean. History isn't simply a collection of dates and names, it's a living dialogue between past and present. The stories we've uncovered together challenge the comfortable narratives we once accepted without question, inviting us to embrace a more complete understanding of this complex holiday's true origins. The stark honesty we've discovered reveals uncomfortable truths about colonial encounters, about promises broken and trust shattered. Yet within this darkness, there's profound wisdom waiting to be acknowledged. Understanding these difficult chapters doesn't diminish gratitude. Instead, it deepens our appreciation for resilience. The indigenous peoples who survived, who preserved their cultures despite overwhelming challenges, their stories deserve recognition alongside the familiar tales of pilgrims and harvest celebrations we learned in childhood. Controversies surrounding Thanksgiving aren't obstacles to overcome, they're invitations to grow. When we acknowledge King Philip's War, when we recognize the systematic displacement of Native communities, we're not destroying tradition, we're enriching it with truth. The candlelight flickering against these pages illuminates more than just words. It reveals the courage required to face history's complexities. This honest reckoning transforms our understanding, making space for both celebration and mourning, for both gratitude and acknowledgement. Reparations remain a difficult conversation, one that extends far beyond monetary compensation. How do we repair centuries of broken treaties, of stolen land, of cultural suppression? The answer lies partly in education, in ensuring future generations understand the complete story. It lies in supporting Indigenous sovereignty, in recognizing ongoing struggles for land rights and cultural preservation. These aren't abstract historical concepts, they're living realities affecting millions of people today, descendants of those first encounters we've explored together. The paradox of memorialization haunts every American holiday, but perhaps none more than Thanksgiving. How do we honor Indigenous heritage while maintaining family traditions? How do we celebrate abundance while acknowledging the cost? The answer isn't choosing sides, it's expanding our capacity to hold multiple truths simultaneously. We can feel grateful for family gatherings while also recognizing the pain this day represents for many. This both and approach, rather than either or thinking, opens pathways toward genuine reconciliation and understanding. Museums and monuments tell selective stories, emphasizing certain perspectives while silencing others. The Plymouth Rock myth, the sanitized First Thanksgiving narrative, these carefully curated memories serve specific purposes. They create national identity, foster patriotic sentiment, provide comfort through simplified narratives. Yet this selective remembering comes at a cost, erasing the voices and experiences of those whose suffering made such celebration possible. Recognizing this doesn't require abandoning all traditions. It simply asks for more inclusive storytelling going forward. Educational systems bear enormous responsibility in shaping collective memory, in determining which stories get told and retold. The elementary school pageants, the construction paper pilgrim hats, these innocent seeming activities embed particular worldviews. They teach children that history is simple, that conflicts have clear heroes and villains, that progress is inevitable. Yet real history is messier, more ambiguous, filled with difficult questions that resist easy answers. Transforming education means embracing this complexity, preparing young minds for nuanced thinking rather than comfortable certainties. Native American Heritage Month, occurring annually in November, offers opportunities for deeper learning. Yet this designation itself reveals the ongoing marginalization, 1 month to acknowledge the original inhabitants of an entire continent. True recognition requires more than designated awareness periods. It demands fundamental shifts in how we understand American identity. It means recognizing that Indigenous peoples aren't historical artifacts. They're contemporary communities with vibrant cultures, ongoing struggles, and invaluable wisdom for addressing modern challenges like environmental stewardship and community resilience. The environmental lessons embedded in these historical narratives remain urgently relevant today. The Indigenous understanding of land as sacred, as something to be stewarded rather than owned, offers alternatives to destructive resource extraction. The colonial mentality that viewed wilderness as something to be conquered, that prioritized individual accumulation over community well-being, these attitudes continue shaping contemporary policy decisions. Learning from traditional ecological knowledge, recognizing the wisdom in sustainable practices developed over millennia, could guide us toward healthier relationships with the natural world. Language itself carries the weight of historical interpretation. The words we choose shape the stories we tell. Calling it the Indian Wars rather than indigenous resistance, describing colonization as settlement. These linguistic choices matter deeply. They influence how events are remembered, whose perspectives are centered, which voices are amplified or silenced. Decolonizing language means paying attention to these subtle but powerful influences, choosing words that honor dignity rather than perpetuate harm, that acknowledge complexity rather than oversimplify difficult truths about our shared past. Personal responsibility emerges as we digest these revelations. Each of us participates in the ongoing creation of collective memory. The stories we share around dinner tables, the questions we ask or avoid, the books we read to children, all contribute to how history lives in the present. We can choose comfort over truth, maintaining familiar narratives that don't challenge our assumptions, or we can embrace the harder path, seeking understanding that includes perspectives previously marginalized, creating space for healing conversations that acknowledge past harm while building toward reconciliation. Religious communities face particular challenges in navigating these complex histories. Many faiths emphasize gratitude, thanksgiving, as sacred practice, yet struggle with the holiday's troubling origins. How do spiritual traditions maintain their core values while acknowledging historical harm? Perhaps the answer lies in expanding definitions of Thanksgiving itself, moving beyond seasonal celebration toward year-round practices of recognition, honoring not just abundance received, but also examining the systems that create scarcity for others, transforming gratitude from passive appreciation into active commitment to justice. The process of unlearning proves just as important as learning new information. Old narratives have deep roots. They're woven into our sense of identity and belonging. Questioning cherished beliefs feels threatening, like losing something precious rather than gaining deeper understanding. Yet this discomfort signals growth, the stretching required for expanded consciousness. Unlearning doesn't mean rejecting everything from the past. It means developing more sophisticated ways of holding truth, creating space for both appreciation and critique, for both tradition and transformation, working together toward healing. As candlelight flickers against these vintage pages, we feel the weight of enlightened empathy settling gently upon us. This knowledge brings responsibility, the obligation to carry these truths forward with wisdom and care. The shadows dancing on parchment remind us that history isn't fixed, it's constantly being interpreted and reinterpreted by each generation. We become part of this ongoing story, contributing our own chapter through the choices we make, the conversations we begin, the bridges we build toward understanding across difference and division. The paradox of memorialization reaches its fullest expression in this moment of reflection. How do we remember without mythologizing, honor without romanticizing, celebrate without erasing? Perhaps the answer lies not in perfect solutions, but in ongoing commitment to complexity, in refusing the comfort of simple stories when difficult truths demand our attention. This both and approach, holding gratitude alongside grief, celebration alongside acknowledgement, creates space for all voices to be heard, for all experiences to find recognition in our expanded understanding of what Thanksgiving truly means. Our exploration draws toward its gentle conclusion, leaving us changed by all we've discovered together. The waning candlelight creates a hushed moment, a breath of anticipation for what story's end might offer. In this quiet space, surrounded by the wisdom of difficult truths, we prepare for sleep with minds more open, hearts more tender, understanding more complete. Tomorrow we'll carry these lessons forward, not as burden, but as gift, using this knowledge to create more just and truthful ways of remembering, celebrating, and living together. Chapter 13, Reflections Under the Harvest Moon. The autumn moon hangs heavy tonight, casting silver shadows across our journey through forgotten history. As we walk this moonlit path together, the stories we've uncovered seem to shimmer in the gentle light. Each revelation about Thanksgiving's true origins, each hidden truth we've explored, now weaves together like threads in an ancient tapestry. The night air carries whispers of the past, inviting us to reflect on all we've learned about this complex holiday. Beneath this harvest moon, we pause to consider the Wampanoag voices that history tried to silence. Their perspectives, once buried beneath layers of colonial narrative, now emerge clearly in the moonlight. We see Massasoit's careful diplomacy understand the seasonal rhythms that guided Indigenous life and recognize the profound wisdom embedded in their relationship with this land. These aren't just stories from the past, they're living testimonies that continue to shape our understanding of gratitude and community today. The moon illuminates another thread in our tapestry, the Plymouth colonists' desperate struggle for survival. Beyond the sanitized textbook version, we've discovered their genuine fear, their crushing hunger during that first brutal winter. The moonlight reveals both their remarkable resilience and their troubling attitudes toward the indigenous people who saved them. This complexity, this human messiness, makes their story more real, more meaningful than any simplified myth ever could. Truth, it seems, is always more nuanced than legend. As we continue our reflective walk, the shadows remind us of those first tentative alliances between two vastly different worlds. The 1621 harvest gathering, that 3-day feast, wasn't the peaceful celebration we were taught. It was a complex diplomatic event, filled with tension and uncertainty. The Wampanoag brought deer, the colonist provided fowl, but both groups watched each other carefully. Trust was fragile, survival was uncertain, and the future remained unwritten beneath stars much like these. The moonlight catches on another memory, the gradual breakdown of that fragile peace. Within a generation, cooperation would give way to conflict. The children of those first feast participants would face King Philip's War, a devastating collision that shattered indigenous communities across New England. Tonight, in this quiet darkness, we honor both the brief moments of understanding and the tragic losses that followed. History, like moonlight, reveals both beauty and sorrow in equal measure. Our footsteps echo softly as we remember Sarah Josepha Hale, the determined magazine editor who spent decades campaigning for a national Thanksgiving holiday. Her vision, shaped by 19th century ideals of domestic harmony, transformed a regional harvest celebration into something entirely different. The Civil War provided the perfect backdrop for Lincoln's proclamation, a desperate attempt to unite a fractured nation through shared gratitude. The holiday we know today, born from this period of national crisis, carries echoes of both hope and division. The harvest moon witnesses our consideration of mythology's power, how simple stories can eclipse complex truths. The Pilgrims and Indians narrative, with its neat moral lessons, served a young nation's need for foundational myths. It painted colonization as divinely ordained, portrayed indigenous people as willing participants in their own displacement, and erased centuries of sophisticated civilization that existed before European arrival. Tonight, we acknowledge both the comfort these stories provided and the harm they perpetuated through their beautiful simplicity. Walking deeper into the moonlit night, we reflect on the holiday's evolution through American decades. Norman Rockwell's paintings, television specials, department store advertisements, each generation added layers to Thanksgiving's mythology. The holiday became a canvas for projecting idealized American values, family unity, abundance, peaceful multiculturalism. Yet beneath these warm images, the original tensions persisted. Indigenous communities continued to grieve, to resist, to remember what was lost, even as the nation celebrated what was found. The moon's glow illuminates something profound, the difference between gratitude and guilt. Understanding Thanksgiving's complex history doesn't require abandoning thankfulness. It invites us toward a more honest appreciation. We can acknowledge the real costs of colonization while still celebrating family, community, and the harvest's abundance. This isn't about destroying traditions, it's about deepening them through truth. Authentic gratitude, like moonlight, grows stronger when it acknowledges both shadow and illumination in equal measure. As our reflective journey continues, we consider how other cultures approach harvest celebrations, from ancient Celtic Samhain to modern Canadian Thanksgiving, from Jewish Sukkot to Hindu Pongal. Humanity has always marked the season's turning with gratitude and ceremony. These traditions remind us that appreciation for abundance, for community, for survival itself, transcends any single nation's story. The harvest moon shines down on countless traditions, each carrying its own wisdom about thankfulness and the cycles of life. The gentle moonlight draws our attention to contemporary voices, modern Indigenous activists, and educators who refuse to let their ancestors' stories remain buried. They speak at protests and powwows, write books and create art, teach children and challenge universities. Their work doesn't seek to destroy Thanksgiving, but to complicate it, to honor both survival and loss. These voices remind us that history isn't finished, that every holiday, every tradition continues to evolve through our collective choices and consciousness. Our moonlit path reveals another truth, that food itself carries memory. The turkey and cranberries, the squash and corn, these weren't accidentally chosen for America's harvest table. Indigenous agricultural knowledge, developed over thousands of years, created the abundance that colonists learned to cultivate. Every Thanksgiving meal, in ways both subtle and profound, represents a collaboration across cultures. The flavors we associate with home, with tradition, with gratitude itself, emerged from this complex intercultural exchange. The harvest moon illuminates one more thread in our tapestry, the possibility of redemption through recognition. When we acknowledge the full story, when we honor both Indigenous resilience and colonial complexity, when we hold space for grief alongside gratitude, something shifts. Thanksgiving can become less about mythologized harmony and more about genuine appreciation. Not appreciation that ignores the past, but appreciation that learns from it, grows through it, and commits to doing better because of it. As we near the end of our reflective walk, the moonlight seems to gather all our discoveries into a single moment of understanding. The real story of Thanksgiving, with all its complexity and contradiction, doesn't diminish the holiday's meaning. Instead, it deepens it. We can gather around tables knowing the full truth, can express gratitude while acknowledging cost, can celebrate abundance while honoring those who paid the price for our prosperity. This awareness, painful yet necessary, transforms shallow thankfulness into profound appreciation. The shadows grow longer as we prepare to conclude our journey through Thanksgiving's hidden history. Tonight, beneath this ancient harvest moon, we've woven together threads of truth that textbooks left scattered. Indigenous wisdom, colonial desperation, national mythology, contemporary reckoning, all these elements create a story far richer than any simple tale of pilgrims and Indians. The moonlight reminds us that truth, like gratitude itself, grows more beautiful when we stop hiding from its complexity. Our reflective walk draws to a close, but the insights we've gathered will continue to illuminate future Thanksgivings. The harvest moon, ancient witness to countless human celebrations and sorrows, blesses our commitment to honest remembrance. As we prepare for our final chapter, we carry with us a deeper understanding of this complex holiday, not the sanitized version we learned in childhood, but the full, nuanced, ultimately more meaningful story that honors both gratitude and truth in equal measure. Chapter 14, Tying Knots, Conclusions and Continuities. Here we stand at the threshold of understanding, where all the threads of our journey converge into a tapestry of truth. The whispered secrets of that first autumn, the complex dance between cultures, the myths that grew like autumn leaves, all settling into place. As we breathe deeply, we feel the weight of centuries, the stories that shaped a nation's memory, coming together in this gentle moment of reflection. Under the watchful eye of history, we've traveled through layers of forgotten narratives, peeling back the golden veneer of childhood stories to discover the raw humanity beneath. The pilgrims, no longer simple figures in black and white, emerge as complex souls navigating impossible choices. The Wampanoag people, their wisdom and pain, their generosity and loss, all woven into the fabric of what we now understand as our shared beginning. Feel how the autumn air carries these stories, like leaves dancing on the wind, each one a fragment of truth, each one a piece of the puzzle. Massasoit's careful diplomacy, Bradford's desperate hope, Squanto's tragic journey between worlds, all converging in that single moment. And when strangers became neighbors, when survival demanded cooperation, when the seeds of a complex future were planted in Plymouth's rocky soil. The harvest moon has watched this story unfold for 4 centuries now, casting its gentle light on the myths we created and the truths we buried. In the soft glow of candlelight, we see how memory transforms, how stories bend like light through water, how the simple narrative of gratitude grew to eclipse the deeper complexities of cultural collision and survival in the New World's unforgiving landscape. Close your eyes and listen to the rustle of parchment pages, each one telling a different version of that first gathering. The official records speak of diplomacy, the oral traditions whisper of caution, the modern myths sing of harmony. Yet beneath it all flows the deeper current of human resilience, the way people find grace, even in the most impossible circumstances, even when worlds collide. The threads weave together now, creating a tapestry both beautiful and troubling. The English colonists, fleeing persecution, yet bringing their own prejudices. The indigenous peoples, showing remarkable generosity despite past betrayals by other Europeans. Both groups seeking survival in an uncertain world, finding themselves bound together by geography, by necessity, by the simple human need to see another winter through. In the amber glow of memory, we see the feast taking shape, not as the simple celebration we learned about in childhood, but as something far more complex, a diplomatic gathering, a cultural exchange, a moment of tentative hope, wrapped in the golden light of autumn, where two worlds touched, however briefly, however imperfectly, in a spirit of cautious cooperation. The aroma of roasted fowl, the sound of different languages mixing in the crisp air, the pilgrims offering their English prayers, the Wampanoag sharing their own sacred traditions, each group maintaining their distinct identity while finding common ground in the universal language of gratitude for survival, of hope for the future, of shared humanity across the vast divide of cultural difference. As we breathe in the cool autumn air, we feel the weight of what came after. The decades of cooperation that followed, the gradual erosion of trust, the wars that would tear apart this fragile peace, the way this single moment of cross-cultural harmony became a symbol, even as the reality grew more complicated, more painful, more distant from the myth we created. Yet in this gentle twilight hour, we can hold both truths, the beauty of that moment when enemies chose cooperation, when strangers shared their table, when gratitude transcended difference, and the sorrow of what followed, when land disputes arose, when misunderstandings multiplied, when the seeds of future conflict were sown alongside the corn in New England's fertile but contested soil. The candlelight flickers softly, illuminating the pages of history, where we discover that truth is rarely simple, rarely comfortable. The real story of Thanksgiving is not the sanitized version we learned as children, but something richer, more complex, more human, a story of survival, of adaptation, of the messy beauty of people trying to build something new in an uncertain world. In the quiet of this moment, we can appreciate the courage it took on all sides. The pilgrims leaving everything familiar behind, the Wampanoag choosing to help strangers despite every reason for suspicion, both groups navigating uncharted waters of cultural exchange, both contributing to a story that would grow beyond anything they could have imagined in that first uncertain autumn. The symphony of experience echoes across centuries now, each generation adding its own notes, its own interpretation, its own understanding, the myth of simple harmony giving way to more nuanced truth, the recognition that gratitude can coexist with grief, that celebration can acknowledge complexity, that honoring the past means embracing all its dimensions, both light and shadow, both hope and loss. As the autumn leaves settle around the foundations of our national memory, we feel a deeper appreciation for the layers beneath the surface story. The courage of Massasoit, the desperation of Bradford, the wisdom of Indigenous elders, the determination of English families, all woven together in a tapestry more beautiful and more complex than any simple myth could ever capture or contain. The parchment rustles softly as we turn the final pages, feeling the vastness of this story stretching across generations, the way a single harvest feast became a national tradition, the way memory transforms reality, the way truth lives, not in simple answers, but in the willingness to hold complexity, to honor all voices, to find gratitude, even in difficult stories, even in uncomfortable truths. And now, as we release this collective sigh, feeling the approach of final rest, we carry with us not just the myth, but the deeper truth. That Thanksgiving, like all human stories, is layered with complexity, rich with meaning, beautiful in its imperfection. As we drift toward sleep, we hold this story gently. All of it, the light and the shadows, the hope and the heartbreak, together. Chapter 15, Restful Resolutions, Stories Under the Stars. Here we are at the end of our journey through time, where the threads of truth weave together beneath this starry canopy of understanding. The flickering lights above mirror the complex history we've uncovered, each star a story, each constellation a connection between past and present. Tonight, as we rest, we carry with us the weight of knowledge and the comfort of deeper understanding. Beneath this celestial quilt, we find ourselves changed by what we've discovered. The simple story of pilgrims and Indians, that comfortable narrative we once knew, has transformed into something far more nuanced, far more human. We've walked through the shadows of history, witnessed the complexity of survival, the delicate negotiations between worlds that collided on Plymouth's shores 4 centuries ago. The stars above us tonight, they witnessed it all. They watched as Tisquantum navigated between cultures, as Massasoit weighed impossible choices, as ordinary people on both sides struggled to understand each other across vast cultural divides. These same stars illuminated treaty negotiations, midnight councils, and moments of unexpected friendship that bloomed despite the mounting tensions and misunderstandings that would follow. Let's breathe deeply now and feel the weight of these stories settling into our understanding. The 3-day harvest celebration of 1621. It wasn't the beginning of Thanksgiving as we know it today. It was simply a moment, a brief intersection of two worlds, where gratitude and diplomacy danced together before the harsh realities of colonization swept across New England like an unstoppable tide. Sarah Josepha Hale, our determined magazine editor, she couldn't have imagined how her tireless campaign would reshape American memory. For 36 years, she wrote letters, published editorials, painted pictures of domestic harmony around turkey and cranberries. Her vision of national unity through shared gratitude became the foundation upon which Lincoln built his wartime proclamation in 1863. The mythologized Thanksgiving, with its neat narrative of friendship and cooperation, it served a purpose in American identity formation. It gave us heroes and villains, a creation story that felt comfortable and inspiring, but real history, the kind that helps us understand our present, requires us to sit with complexity, to hold multiple truths simultaneously, to honor both connection and conflict. Indigenous peoples across America, they've carried the weight of this mythology for generations. Every November brings reminders of a narrative that often erases their ancestors' experiences, that transforms survival strategies into simple friendship, that overlooks the devastating consequences of European settlement. Yet many have found ways to reclaim this season, to honor their own traditions of gratitude and harvest. The department stores of the early 1900s, they understood something profound about American psychology. They recognized that Thanksgiving could become a bridge, a launching pad into the commercial magic of Christmas. The Macy's parade, the football games, the shopping madness all emerged from this recognition that gratitude could be packaged, marketed, and sold alongside the turkey and stuffing. Franklin Roosevelt learned sometimes even presidents can't change tradition overnight. When he moved Thanksgiving a week earlier in 1939, hoping to extend the Christmas shopping season, he discovered that some things run deeper than economic policy. Half the states ignored him, creating two different Thanksgivings until Congress finally stepped in and settled the matter permanently. But here's what remains beautiful about this holiday. Despite its complicated origins, despite the mythology and commercialization, the core human impulse endures. Families still gather, friends still reconnect, people still pause to acknowledge what they're grateful for. The specific historical details may be fuzzy, but the desire to express gratitude, that's as real as the autumn leaves falling outside your window. Modern Thanksgiving tables, they tell their own stories now. The recipes passed down through generations, the new traditions families create, the empty chairs that remind us of loved ones who've passed, the extra places set for chosen family. Each meal becomes its own small ceremony of connection, its own acknowledgement that we're all part of something larger than ourselves. The turkey industry, the cranberry bogs, the sweet potato farms, they've all grown around this single day. Millions of birds raised specifically for these tables, tons of produce harvested for this celebration. The economic machinery of Thanksgiving, it employs thousands, feeds millions, and creates its own rhythm in the American agricultural calendar, a testament to how deeply embedded this holiday has become. School pageants still happen every November. Children still dress as pilgrims and Indians. Teachers still struggle with how to tell this story responsibly. The conversation is evolving slowly as educators work to include more perspectives, to acknowledge complexity, to teach gratitude without perpetuating harmful myths. Change happens gradually, one classroom at a time, one honest conversation at a time. As we drift toward sleep tonight, let's carry with us this expanded understanding. We can be grateful for connection without ignoring conflict. We can honor tradition while acknowledging its limitations. We can celebrate togetherness while remembering those whose stories were overlooked. This isn't about guilt or shame, it's about growth, about expanding our capacity for both gratitude and truth. The stars above us, they've been witnesses to all of human history. They've watched civilizations rise and fall, seen countless moments of both cruelty and kindness, observed the endless human struggle to understand each other across difference. Tonight, under their patient gaze, we can rest knowing that truth and gratitude, they can coexist. They can even strengthen each other when held with gentle hands. So close your eyes now and let this knowledge settle into your dreams. Tomorrow's Thanksgiving, whatever form it takes for you, will be informed by this deeper understanding. You'll know the full story now, the complex truth behind the simple tale. And perhaps, in that knowing, you'll find an even deeper reason to be grateful for the messy, beautiful, complicated gift of human connection. Sleep well.